All right, thanks everyone for coming to our session on skills-based hiring. My name's Steve Taylor. We're gonna skip the intros because all of our names and affiliations are up there on screen. Our bios are in the app, so please take a look there if you want to connect with somebody up on stage. But yeah, we're here to talk about skills-based hiring, one of the most purple issues of the day. We are seeing a ton of momentum around skills-based hiring in the states. We now have over 20 states who have taken the necessary steps to move away from degrees as proxies in hiring and really focus on the dignity of individuals, on whole human hiring, on individuals' experience, their motivation to contribute, their skills and aptitudes. And so this is just a first step. But before we dive into skills-based hiring and the policies and implementation, it's important to know who we're trying to serve with these policies. So Byron, who are STARS? Why do we care about them?
Yeah, what do you know? I have a mic here. It's on. All right. So yeah, so we're going to talk about policies and we're going to talk about process and skills-based hiring, skills-first hiring. That's a process framing. But let's talk about people for a second. There are 70 million Americans who are STARS. That is to say, they are skilled through alternative routes. Skilled through alternative routes, that's STARS. That's 70 million people. They have high school degrees or equivalent. They are deeply attached to the labor market. They're doing a job. They've done lots of jobs. And so we know they have skills because there are 0 jobs that you can do without skills, right? 0. So it's just which skills for which jobs and what experience. And I just want to be clear, this is, when I say skilled through alternative routes at STARS, this is not alternative people and it's not alternative skills. It's alternative routes. They got there by a different route, and the reason we have to say that is because we've gotten to a point where for a whole class of jobs that pay well, and most of them, we're assuming that college is completion of college is the only way you can start on that journey. And we all know that we've learned most of our skills from the work we do, and we know that for college grads, but we act as if it's not true for non-college grads, but it absolutely is true. So what I would just say as a backdrop to this entire conversation, if your skills-based hiring approach just gets you the same people in different seats, it's probably not doing the job. There's a massive amount of overlooked talent, and when you think about STARS, it focuses you on what they have, which is skills, aptitudes, and by the way, a tremendous amount of resourcefulness and adaptability that you might not be getting as fully if you're not looking at all the talents. So I think that's where I'd like to start.
Yeah, so I think that's key. This is an opportunity to narrow the opportunity gap and make sure that we're leveling the playing field for those who can do the work if we just remove that barrier. So we've got 2 folks from states who have led the way on skills-based hiring. Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you first. Governor Polis was one of the first governors to enact a policy around skills-based hiring, and then recently has followed up on that promise with work around apprenticeships to make sure that the state adopts those. As you think about Colorado, what you've done over the past year plus since that policy was enacted, what's that look like? How is Colorado implementing skills-based hiring?
Thank you, Steve. Governor Polis definitely believes that we have to create a Colorado for all, and part of that is all Coloradans have an opportunity to succeed in their communities with livable wage jobs that they can survive, not just survive, but do well. I think the skills-based hiring practice was a really natural flow into registered apprenticeship programs as we look at experiential skill development and opportunities that create pathways for people to enter into occupations that are in demand that don't look at proxies as a gatekeeper. Really, he also felt that government can't ask private sector to move to a skills-based economy if we're not doing it ourselves. And so making sure that within state government, all our job descriptions were moving towards skills-based as an option, not just a piece of paper that gets you in the door. I think in my department, the Department of Labor and Employment, 80% of our job descriptions are skills-based today. There's a requirement that in all departments in state government that they reach 25% by this year's end and then a 50% goal. So we really want to move the scale, but also making sure that we're bringing in partners like Opportunity at Work to help with government move from bureaucracy, and we can't do that. It's in the statute. We need these things to really help hiring authorities try to move the continuum of what is the competency and skill needed for the job, not just that proxy such as years of experience or a piece of paper. Registered apprenticeship programs really the governor wanted to double down. We were part of the federal system. In July of last year, we became a state apprenticeship agency and really trying to move forward with quality that creates innovative apprenticeship skills. Construction trades, very important, very needed at this time, but really moving into the finance sector, the insurance sector, the healthcare sector, so that people have another way to earn and learn at the same time. We're really trying to make sure that people in Colorado who just don't have the opportunity to stop working and earn a wage, that they can continue to move forward on skill development while they're earning a wage.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Nicholas, in Virginia, so Governor Youngkin's order around skills-based hiring was timed with sort of a reformation of the state's workforce development system, where the legislature and the governor came together, enacted a law to completely revamp workforce development in the state. So that was a really important demand side effort, and then sending the signal around skills-based hiring paired with that. As you think about the Commonwealth and how the Commonwealth is now bringing together the workforce system and the higher ed system, what is that looking like in terms of implementation?
Thanks, Steve. I think a couple of things. One of the panels that I sat on yesterday, one of the things that individuals thought were very interesting in the governor's office, were very intentional about pairing workforce and labor, so much so that the education secretary and the labor secretary would actually sit next to each other on the same floor. And I think that that shows the governor's perspective in terms of how these two pieces of a puzzle work together. And we were thinking about workforce solutions across government and in a variety of ways, one of which is, identifying what the problem is, right? We know, Byron had mentioned the 70 million stars, right? And that's coupled with a couple other statistics that I think are really critical to understand, which is, 50% of the workforce lacks a college degree, right? And 75% of employers find it difficult to find skilled talent, right? And that is coupled with the fact that 72% of employers say that a college degree is not an indicator of skills. So we have this confluence of problems, and what that resulted in Virginia is last May, the governor sort of made a landmark change in terms of how we think about looking for talent amongst our civil servants. And what he did was he eliminated degree requirements, preferences, or both for almost 90% of our civil service jobs. And that took effect in July of last year, so we're about 8 months into it, and the data has been really interesting, which I can get into a little bit later. But what we are doing through this executive action is expanding opportunities and career paths for all citizens in Virginia, and enhancing our ability, I think most importantly, to deliver quality service to our citizens. It also changes about how we think about workforce planning and talent acquisition in the Commonwealth. And what it does is it also makes us recognize that there are multiple ways that we learn through our lifetimes, right? Certifications, competency-based education, apprenticeship programs. These are things that we're really thinking about intentionally in Virginia. And it's really about understanding and focusing on an individual's skills, abilities, competencies, and also, I think most importantly, and my state counterpart will probably agree with me, individual's passion for public service. And we don't want to exclude millions of individuals who have a willingness to serve their citizenry. So it's just a couple of things that we are doing in Virginia to sort of re-envision workforce solutions. Another thing is sort of barriers to occupational entry in terms of licensure and credentialing. And so we are being very intentional about also breaking down barriers to mandated occupational fields, thinking about how we can reduce processing times for required credentialing. So lots of different workforce solutions that we're envisioning in the Commonwealth.
Appreciate that. And I'm going to come back to you later when we start to talk about higher education and their role in skills-based hiring. So as we think about skills-based hiring in the public sector, it's also going to be really important to talk about skills-based hiring in the private sector. And one thing that we've been hearing across our partners in the Stand Together community is for the private sector, there's some risk associated with skills-based hiring in the sense that right now degrees are sort of that safe proxy for quality candidates. And if you start to look at things like alternative assessments, there may be some legal uncertainty or regulatory uncertainty or policy uncertainty. So if we think about the role of the public sector here, they're sort of paving the way. They can absorb some of that early risk in the process of adopting and testing new skills-based policies and assessments. So Byron, before we jump to Debbie and Shannon, talk a little bit about what Opportunity at Work is doing in partnership with NGA around a public sector hub and public sector implementation, and that sort of marriage with what you're learning from private sector actors.
Yeah, well, so Opportunity at Work Start, we were mainly working with private sector employers on really this kind of awareness to action phase of understanding STAR's talent, and that's why we really focused first on data, because to do something at a large scale, businesses need data, they need business process, they need to know, and so much of skills-based hiring right now, the solutions are relatively small scale, like they don't work with the main system. So we were setting that in place, and about 2 years ago, I was talking to then Governor Larry Hogan in Maryland, his chief of staff, about this, and they're like, "Well, we hire a lot of people. We ought to do this. We ought to do this too." I was like, "Yeah, you ought to do this too." And they're like, "Will you help us?" They're like, "Okay, we'll try to help you." And it was such a fascinating thing because I had been in private sector most of my career. I'd been in government a little bit. 2 years in the White House, and I had about the same number of heartbeats in my 2 years in the White House as my 20 years in the private sector, so that was an experience. But I didn't think, when I came into it, that government would move as fast. And honestly, credit where credit is due. States have really moved on this. I mean, you have Colorado and Virginia, but I'll tell you, with Governor Hogan, he really landed it, and he's talked about the 1.3 million stars in Maryland and talked about the work to do in Maryland and the need for your skills and talent. Not like, oh, we're kind of like making room for you. It's like, no, we need you. Like, you don't give someone a job. Jobs, like, work is an exchange. They're giving you their energy, their talent, their passion. And setting it that way and focusing on the problems to solve and people's roles in it, and that just set this on fire. They had 400% increase in job applications from stars, latest data, and the Moore administration has continued it across party lines and built on it. And they're getting really great results. And I think there was something about what we learned from that. Is there's something not just about the technical aspects of it, because you have to work through all of that. You have to be fair. You have to have clear standards, all the rest of it. But there's something about the narrative too, about this isn't about somehow. So it's not a program. Do you know what I mean? It's a mindset that says, like, everybody has something to contribute, and we want to know what you have to contribute. And so what we've seen now, this adoption, these executive orders, in some cases legislation, there's still a lot of work to do. And so we are working with NGA and many other partners in Cicero, lots of folks, and we are going to be launching officially later in May of this year a STARS Public Sector Hub. The goal being for first states, but then other public sector entities, to have a learning community, to have the data, to have the best practices, and to just really accelerate the learning. We have this network on Tear the Paper Ceiling of mainly private sector companies. We're learning a ton in that context, but it is a fair thing to say government, there's certain ways government is accountable. They have to do it in certain ways, and we think there's just so much learning to be had, and we're very, very excited about it. And I think, I agree with you, Joe, that when a governor or a mayor can say, we are walking the walk, it puts you in a much stronger position to inspire and challenge your private sector to do the same. And I can't wait to see the progress we'll make in the next 2 years.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So speaking of the private sector, and there's a lot to learn from the private sector, so Shannon, in the healthcare sector, what has this looked like in terms of a shift towards skills-based hiring?
Yeah, so first of all, we got the message in the private sector. And the reason why it's important that I start there is because there's a lot of shifts happening. One, as baby boomers retire, right, there's just simply not, and with the skills and knowledge that they are walking away into retirement with, there's just not enough bodies to replace the talent with. So that has created this hole of talent, right? Then you have post-COVID, right, where there's still 33% of the population who haven't returned to the workforce, right? And then it's just expensive, right? If you have to hire, it is just really, really expensive to hire lots of people at 20, 30, 40% markup on jobs that you didn't have to pay for. So I think that's important to level set. But some things that we're doing at HCSC We are, I believe Joe and Byron talked about barriers to entry. So we're not only are we removing the degree requirements at HCSC, we have 30,000 employees there, but we're also thinking about wraparound services, right? So when you remove the degree in vulnerable populations, it's like, I still have to think about childcare. I still have to think about transportation to work, right? And so if we're really gonna do this, how do we think about this holistically? And so those are some ways that we're really thinking about really getting into and building skills. And then one last thing I'll say is that we're standing up an entire line of business called HCSC Early Careers, where we're leaning into high schools, trade schools, certificate programs, in addition to our traditional intern and college. And we're really leaning into that and pouring some funds into that so that we can make that change. And the last thing I'll say is that the change is hard. Forever and ever and ever, we've gone with, you gotta have a degree and 6 years of experience. You gotta have a master's in this. And when I announced this to our talent acquisition team, I thought some of them had heart palpitations because they're just so used to that standard. And so it's gonna be a shift, a cultural shift for us, but we're ready for that challenge.
So and we'll come back to that cultural shift piece in a second. So I think one thing in removing degree requirements, if we look at the data around degree attainment, we know that degree attainment largely favors white and Asian students. So requiring degrees already marginalizes Black and brown communities. And so Debbie, as you think about OneTen and how you're working with companies to narrow those opportunity gaps, what does that look like? And maybe first, give us the landscape of OneTen, the vision, and how you're working with employers.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So OneTen, for those of you not familiar, came into existence about 3 years or so ago. And this was unfortunately at the end of the George Floyd murder. And so you had a coalition of about 60, 70 companies that decided that they wanted to do something to make a difference as the world was basically chaotic, at the time. And so this was founded by 5 former CEOs from the private sector, from, American Express to IBM to Amgen, so on and so forth. And so this coalition was formed around 4 factors. It was for Black talent and others without a 4-year degree. It was to lean into roles and opportunities that are family sustaining. So this was not minimum wage. These are big Fortune 500 companies, and we wanted to ensure whatever those jobs were, that these would be wages to provide for your family, whatever the dynamic of the family was. The other would be the focus in terms of skills, skills focused, and we really wanted to ensure that we were helping organizations re-credential their jobs. So if you think about it, for OneTen, it's a little bit different. This was organizations that were passionate about the belief. So we didn't need to do a lot to convince organizations that this was the right thing to do. However, I think as already mentioned, this is fundamentally not an initiative. This can't be seen as like an HR thing. This is a movement. It has to be embedded and woven into the culture of organizations. So this is practice change. This can't be the CEO said, go do this thing. You have to fundamentally change how you think about hiring. Not traditionally, we're trying to disrupt, I would say, the traditional way of hiring. So you have to go several layers deeper. At the talent acquisition, you have to embed this in human capital management, payroll practices, which is not something that we typically think about. As I've been taking in this conference, there's a lot around how we're talking about talent and skills first, but we do need to flip the page and say, how do we actually help employers on the private sector because they have the jobs? So if we're doing all the preparation of the talent, what are the roles that we should be thinking about and aligning those skills, the skills that are needed, the technical skills, re-credentialing jobs that have the opportunity, and then preparing our talent to actually be work ready so that organizations are really more open to taking this type of talent that can actually flourish. And we have wonderful stories that are just heartwarming in terms of differences that we're making, but I think that's what this is all about.
So culture is an important part, and the policy enactment is the easy part. Making a commitment, standing up there as a CEO or a governor and saying, we're doing this, great. Maybe it trickles down to your CHRO. When it gets to the hiring managers and the folks who are actually making the decisions and filtering people in and out of roles, I think that's where the rubber meets the road, and curious to hear from each of you about that culture aspect, and maybe starting with Joe and Nicholas, in the civil service, right? The perception maybe is that government is slow to respond, or that civil servants might be slow to change or slow to move. What does that look like in terms of moving civil servants and moving hiring managers in state government to adopt new policies and practices?
Great question. I think what we really need to understand, and in Colorado, if you think about large employers, if you take state, county, and federal government workers, we're a big, large workforce. And so we compete with the Amazons and the United Airlines, and so we hire a lot of people into government. So how do we make sure that there are access points for everyone to look at a career in state government, county government, federal government in Colorado? So how do we make sure at the gate we allow high school students through internships, registered apprenticeship programs to learn about opportunities, career paths in state government? I also think from a policy perspective, cultural perspective, how do we, as employers in the community, compete for talent and really look at what are the essential skills, competencies that are required in our occupations, in our classified occupations, that we have for years and years put a proxy such as years of experience or a credential, a piece of paper, from accessing talent that could otherwise demonstrate they have that skill or competency. And so there is a lot of practice change to say, oh, my application requires associate's degree, a 4-year degree, but in exchange for that, if I put in there skills and competencies, how do I know I am using the right assessments? There are tools that can help you do that. There are opportunities to retrain your HR director, your hiring authorities to make sure that you are getting talent that can do the jobs. And then also, I think from an employer perspective, you're getting talent that is interested, they're using the skill sets they think they know they are good at, and it creates longevity and opportunity for them to move into career paths that they have purpose in their meaning. So the hiring hopefully is better, the retention is better, the quality of work is better when you hire right through skills and competencies rather than taking a proxy that we traditionally have. So I think there are tremendous barriers, but there are things we can do as government, as HR directors to make sure that the process supports the new paradigm, if you will, because we will always have occupations that require a 4-year degree or an advanced degree. But this is another way for people to enter into occupations and have a career path in state government that leads to an opportunity that they find purposeful, passion in their job, and hopefully a long-time career.
So Nicholas, in the Commonwealth, are there certain partners that you're relying on to help shape that culture throughout the Commonwealth in terms of changing hiring and practices?
Yeah, I think a couple of things here. This is still relatively new to the Commonwealth, and we are sort of a measure, twice cut once type of state. We like to do it right the first time. And so we're being very intentional about how we approach this. The Governor Youngkin is very much a business-focused individual and sort of is always thinking about what is the problem, what is the solution, how do we get there? And it really is that simple. And again, some of the data that I read earlier sort of led us to where we are in terms of us focusing in on this. And we've had such great success over the course of the last 8 months. I had our HR folks pull some data this morning. They were probably very excited to wake up to a 6 a.m. email from me this morning. But what we saw is that before July 1 of 2023, in the first 6 months, we had about 105 applications for civil servants positions before this order went into effect. And in the last 6 months of 2023, we had a 41% uptick of 159,000 applicants, right? So this is working.
41% uptick in non-degree applicants.
Correct, yes. So we're very excited about where this is taking us now. Obviously, correlation is not causation, and we still have lots of research and data to go on this. But we're being very intentional about how we do this. And I think that one of the things that sort of I'm up here representing sort of from the education perspective is that this is not a zero-sum game. Just because we are talking about skills-based hiring doesn't mean we are suggesting that there is not value in a 4-year degree. But what we are saying in Virginia, and what the governor always says and the Secretary of Education always say, is that we want the citizens of our great Commonwealth to understand that economic mobility does not necessarily always equate to a 4-year degree, that there are multiple pathways to economic success in the Commonwealth and across our country. And it's about a culture shift. It's about understanding here. I think that we've done a real disservice over the course of the last several decades in the United States of sort of pounding this drum that the only way that you can be successful is through a 4-year degree. And I think we are starting to see a culture shift now, and I think that it is incumbent upon us as state leaders, as private sector, to work hand in hand together. I think that where higher education can be great partners on this is also recognizing that they need to do a better job of connecting with the workforce and not operating in silos, which we've unfortunately done for many, many decades, too many decades. And there are a lot of ways that we are doing this in Virginia. We are focusing our community colleges, for example, on non-degree credentials. We've made tremendous investments in what we call a workforce credential grant program, where it's a performance-based program that really focuses on students getting credentials, not necessarily degrees. And over the course of the last several years, we've seen an uptick in that program to the tune of about 63,000 enrollees and 44,000 credentials granted. And these are non-degree credentials that we're using in this sort of the skills-based realm. So we're very excited about these initiatives.
Yeah, that's great. So Shannon and then Debbie. So Shannon, in the healthcare sector, the challenges may be slightly different than Debbie. You're working with a vast array of employers. What is this looking like in terms of healthcare jobs? Are there certain jobs or pathways that there's less resistance to embrace skills-based hiring in the healthcare space?
I wouldn't say less resistance. I think as I was listening to some of my peers here, I think change is hard, right? And I think one of the things that we have to do is make people feel like they're a part of change instead of change happening to them. Because that's when people will fight change, right? And when you make people feel like they're a part of change, then to your earlier question around that, once it gets past kind of the CHRO and it gets down there, and it's that crowd swayer on the team, right? It's that seasoned employee who's like, I've seen this before, I've been here for 20 years, don't worry, it'll go away in a year. That person, that's who you gotta go find, and that's who you gotta go say, come on, I need you to help me make this change, and I need you to help me roll this out to the team, and that's where you see momentum. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's different. I think it's about a mind shift and including people a part of the change to make it happen.
Yeah, and we've seen some great examples of employers doing this, like Discover in south side of Chicago, really working to help skilled talent attain really good paying jobs. You're working with some amazing companies on this. What are some of the key learnings that those companies are able to share?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one thing, just to maybe take a step back, we did a survey midsummer, and we found that 91% of it was about 500 or so companies believe in skill-based hiring. So it's not that there's a disbelief, but when you started to ask the question deeper as well, then why haven't you? You started to get a new bias that I guess what I would say would be introduced was it was like, okay, that's fine, but what about the durable skills? So now soft skills became sort of a new thing to say is the problem. What about critical thinking and presentation skills and verbal skills, so on and so forth. So we found that interesting. But when we get companies, to your point, just to give you two examples. So we have an organization, Cleveland Clinic, and we have Delta Airlines, two very different organizations, and came to OneTen for very different reasons. So if you go back again to our creation, Cleveland Clinic in the midst of the pandemic was, not say under a crisis, but I think the medical field was, not say under attack, but there was just sort of this disbelief on, can you really help me? Are you really looking at me, a black, brown person in this sort of healthcare industry? And they went through an amazing transformation on really trying to educate their middle managers, really embrace skills-first hiring, looked at their jobs and really realized this is in the medical field because, clearly I think if, you're a doctor or a nurse, I think a degree would be important. But there are other professions that do not require that. So there was a little bit of demystifying what that industry really needed and was a degree required. So you can find that there are probably 60% of the jobs that are out here could be re-credentialed to focus on skills. 40% absolutely still require it. But the math doesn't math because it's 66% of Americans that do not have a 4-year degree. So we're in this vicious cycle. If we don't change this mindset, we're going to continue to have this challenge. For Delta, it really was a different sort of path. I mean, it's the airline, people are very, very familiar, but they introduced things not only externally, but internally with apprenticeships and looking at alternative pathways of how do you focus on economic mobility within your organization also. So this isn't about just acquiring new talent, but it's how do you help those that are already with you to advance and have alternative pathways as well. So 2 different scenarios, but really quite successful.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So as we think about what's happening in the public sector and the private sector, there are some naysayers who are saying, skills-based hiring, maybe it's a fad. Degrees are still the strong signal. If you look at the data, generally or historically, a degree has paid off over the lifetime and helped spur economic opportunity. As we think about the debate recently around debt and degrees, that value and relevance of degrees is being increasingly called into question. Costly degrees, huge underemployment problem in this country, and so skills-based hiring is a strategy to address that. But of course, higher education, right? The elephant in the room. Is there a seat at the table for higher education? If so, how do we engage higher education so they're part of the solution and they're not on the sidelines waiting with degrees, ready to jump in if and when skills-based hiring implementation doesn't go right? And we've got a Deputy Secretary of Education who works closely with post-secondary institutions in the state. So we'll start with you, Nicholas.
Yeah. Let me first and foremost say, in case any of my public institutions are watching this, that we value higher education in Virginia tremendously. The governor just introduced some amendments to his budget to the tune of an additional $1 billion over the biennium, which brings our total investment in public higher education to about $7 billion over 2 years in the Commonwealth. So tremendous investments in our higher education system. But again, I think that what we are focusing in Virginia on much more intentionally than ever before is data and outcomes and questioning the value of what we are offering as a Commonwealth. And we go through this process called a 6-year planning process in Virginia that's required by statute. And it traditionally has been a very compliance-oriented exercise that sort of precedes the biennium budget. It's really basically institutions' wish list for what should be in the budget. And the Young administration came in and said, listen, if we have to go through this process, it should actually mean something. So we brought in the Boston Consulting Group, and we really created much more data visualizations around the outcomes of our programs and the expenditures and costs of our institutions. And what it has led us to really think about is making sure that we are offering a product that students and families care about, and we are doing it at a price that makes the most sense. And so really working with our Virginia Office of Economics, Education Economics, to really think about high demand fields. I sort of made this joke yesterday that I remember, 20 years ago in higher education, we used to use like BLS as like the end all be all in terms of demand, right? And really that's terrible data, honestly, to be using to figure out what the demand is in your state for credentials. And so we really look at them from a local level, a regional level, and a state level much more intentionally these days. So I think it's about bringing higher education along and, again, connecting education and the workforce much more intentionally through data, through conversations, through workforce development boards. The Secretary of Education actually sits as a member of the workforce board in the Commonwealth. So I think it's, again, about being much more thoughtful and intentional about how we connect the workforce and higher education. It's not a zero-sum game here. There's room for higher education. There's room for skills-based learning. And I think the moment that we think about them as sort of a zero-sum game, we've sort of lost the argument from the beginning.
So Byron, and then we'll go to Joe. What has the receptivity been from higher education to the Tear the Paper Ceiling campaign?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, higher education, first of all, I'm not on board with sort of blaming higher ed for this because, like the last I checked, no faculty senate ever voted that like higher ed, should be the only way to get a decent job in the country. To the extent that this has happened, in a way, employers have sort of weaponized higher ed in a sense, right? And the degree by stating that this is what you're looking for. And in 2002, that was a convenience. I mean, you understood it, right? You were going to digital job search, and now instead of 30 applications, you have 300, 400, 500, and you had only keyword searches to screen them. So in that context, like a bachelor's degree, it solved the problem. But last I checked, we're in 2024. Have you heard of big data analytics? Have you heard of AI? It's ridiculous. And on anyone who's still using keyword screening from 2002, to form their talent pool should be embarrassed. You should be embarrassed and you should start doing your job, is my view. I mean, it's coming from the private sector, but I think there's something else here that's really important to understand. How much this is happening in a system. Because once you've got a system grooved, right? If you try to change your little part of it and all the rest of it is working in a different direction, we have to admit it is actually kind of hard to change. And I mean, part of the power of the Tear the Paper Ceiling campaign, there is power in intention. We talk a lot about moving from awareness to action. The pivot between awareness and action is intention, where you decide, you know what, we should change it. We need to figure out a way to do it. And you should not underestimate that moment, because businesses have solved way harder problems than this one because they wanted to and they saw the motivation in it. So I would say that what I want to say about higher ed most of all is that college is for millions of people an incredible bridge to opportunity. And if we make it a drawbridge, that if you pull up behind it and you don't get across it, that's a disastrous use of higher education in our society. More than half of stars have college credits. They had the ambition, the aspiration, all of that to go to college. They dropped out of college not because they were irresponsible, but because they were responsible. They were working 30, 40 hours a week. Their course schedule didn't match their work schedule. They couldn't get the prerequisites in time. So it's now 7 years, their money runs out after 3 years. That's what happens. There's incredible talent, resilience, adaptability that's going on. And I think it's really incumbent on us to not put this on individuals, but put it on our institutions. Because I go talk to people, and by the way, it's not just black and brown people. Rural America as a whole is like actually significantly more disadvantaged than black people as a whole. And so it's really, people are there and they're telling me, I know what I can do, but no one will give me a chance. We want a world where if you can do the job, you can get the job. That's not too much to ask, but that world depends on employers changing. It depends on policymakers changing. And what opportunity work, what our role, we don't see it as, we don't know the best way for a state to do X, Y, or Z, or for an airline or for a healthcare company. You can't. But what we're trying to do is provide the utility. We're trying to provide the data, the visualization, the ability, and fundamentally, if you can learn from each other, we've seen it. Somebody's probably solved the part of the problem you're trying to solve. But there's no kind of basis for you working with, so OneTen does this, we do this, and I just think, look, we can't, the problem's not going to solve itself. It's not going to be solved by accident, and it's not going to be solved in silos. But we absolutely can solve it together and on purpose. And so I think there's real value in turning this kind of conversation into shared action.
Yeah, appreciate that. Joe, you were going to chime in, and then I've got one last question because we were down to just under 3 minutes.
Real quick, I think, the ecosystem needs to move along the continuum together. You can't have the supply side talent talking about skills and competencies if you don't have the demand side on the same page with the skills and competencies to the job. So education, I think, can be a tremendous partner to blur those lines. We need to look at education coming into business and industry and asking them to be co-producers of talent moving forward. That learning doesn't have to happen separate from being on the job. And so we need more opportunities for post-secondary education to make sure they're putting learners on the job and giving them credit for that. I think that's a way to move forward where everyone wins.
Great. So last question. We're in an election year. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, what is one policy that you want to make sure federal policymakers focus on as it relates to advancing a skills-based workforce? And we'll start with you, Joe, and move on down the line.
This one's, I would say we need national immigration policy. There is a group of workers that just don't have the ability to access the talent, the work streams in their communities. And so I think that would be a tremendous boost to our employers if we could get to an agreement on national immigration policy.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a policy, but I would just say let's not run away from DE&I. Let's lean into DE&I. Understand that there's a threat that's real. Change the letters around, add a letter. I don't really necessarily care, but let's just lean into it opposed to run away.
Well, we should recognize that most policy here that matters isn't federal policy, state policies, local policies, and frankly, corporate policies. A lot of the red tape in this situation isn't government red tape. It's actually corporate red tape. But that being said, I think at a federal level, and we're making some progress towards this, figuring out how to finance, if a pathway is actually working for people, you should put more money behind it so more people can get through it. And so for that, for actually money to follow success is something the federal government could do a lot to help with.
I'm going to sort of modify the question and say, what do I want to see at the state in the next year?
Are you a politician?
Yeah, right. You know, executive actions, administrative actions are really nice, but memorializing something in legislation is always better, to stand the test of time. And so we came very close in Virginia memorializing skills-based hiring practices in legislation this General Assembly session. We unfortunately didn't get there this time, but I think that we will get there next time. So I'd like to sort of see that happen.
Great. And Shannon, round us out.
Really quick, I would say student debt. There's a lot of companies who are setting up 401k-like programs where you can donate money and then the company will match it and you can pay your lender. And I think not only the private sector needs to jump on board, but the government needs to as well.
Great. Well, let's thank our panelists for a great session. Thank you.